G'day everyone, Kate from the Narrate team here. This week is part 3 of the series Toxic Views. Adam starts in Genesis, discovering that we are made for responsibility. However, far too often we are caught carrying responsibilities alone. What if we have developed a view of God that treats doing stuff for God as more important than doing stuff with God?
It's great to be with you. How many of you know the name Nora Ephron, or Ephron, or whatever, however you want to pronounce it? And Nora, of course, you may or may not know, she recently passed, actually, most famous for her writing work. Her most famous writing work was behind 2 movies. Anybody? Sleepless in, When Harry Met Sally. Tom got it. And, it was one row back, sorry. Sleepless in Seattle and When Harry Met Sally. Some of you are alive today because those movies were made. Just saying. So Nora was, of course, a very decorated, honored writer, and yet, interestingly enough, she said that the skills that she developed as a writer weren't learned. She didn't learn them primarily as a writer. She learned them as a journalist. Before she wrote the scripts for movies, she worked in the fast-paced world of journalism. And I recently read where she had said that the most important lesson she learned in journalism, she learned in the first class she ever took. It was Journalism 101 at Beverly Hills High School. She was but a freshman, and there on the first day of class, her teacher explained to them that journalism is all about the lead. It's all about getting the lead right, of sifting through the who, when, where, why, and how, and getting a very concise lead written. He then, this is the first day of class, he told the class, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a bit of information, and we're all going to practice writing a lead. So get your pencils out and get ready to raise your hands, and here we go. He then read them this is not from the Bible. This is because I didn't have anywhere else to put it, so I taped it inside my Bible. Kenneth L. Peters, the principal of Beverly Hills High School, announced today that the entire high school faculty will travel to Sacramento next Thursday for a colloquium in new teaching methods. Among the speakers will be anthropologist Margaret Mead, college president Dr. Robert Maynard Hutchins, and California Governor Edmund Pat Brown. So there's the who, what, when, where, why, and how. Troy, what's the lead? Just kidding. I'm not going to put you on that spot. So then, students are raising their hand, and they're taking a swing at the lead, and students are writing things down. And after several attempts, and all of them rebuffed by their teacher, he finally said, okay, here it is. Here's the lead. You ready for it? There's no school next Thursday. He said, that's the lead. And what she went on to explain was that what she learned as a writer was people don't want someone regurgitating the facts for them. What they want them doing is sifting through all the who, what, when, where, why, and how, and telling them what really matters about that information, the why behind the information. And I say all that to say we've been in this series since January, the first week in January, called Toxic Views. And what we've been exploring are the ways in which, with the best of intentions, we get God wrong. We've been trying to allow that, for me to tell you that my view of God is all right and yours is all wrong, that's gross. And it's gross whether I'm a pastor or whether I'm a friend sitting across the coffee shop from you, that there's something repulsive about anybody telling anyone else that their view of God is sound and perfect and somebody else's is completely imperfect. And yet what we've been trying to allow for is that being the case, it's also possible that you can get God wrong. And getting God wrong doesn't just have effects when you're watching Alex Trebek and you're trying to answer the category of Bible. That getting God wrong translates into marriage and raising kids and finances and everything else. This morning, I want to talk about how getting God wrong as it relates to the why. And in some ways, this will be the most simplistic message perhaps you've ever heard, especially if you've been in church for a while. But I guess I want to talk about a toxic view that I caught developing in myself. And that quite frankly, I think the longer you follow Jesus, the more susceptible you are to it. We work really hard around here to create experiences that are particularly engaging and challenging for people, for those of you that aren't particularly interested in church or Jesus. And yet, quite honestly, I think this morning the highest level of relevance is for those of you that identify as Christ followers, who have been Christ followers for months or years or even decades. And I think that what I want to work through is this toxic view that I think so easily develops. And the problem is it doesn't just develop, it's celebrated. That all too often, guys like me and people who speak on God's behalf, as dangerous as that is, this is what we celebrate. And yet if we were to dig through it, we would see it's gross. And for those of you that you don't identify as Christ followers, I think the value for you this morning, if nothing else, is one of the conversations I've had with many of you, and one of the privileged conversations I love to have with many people who call Narrate home, are with those of you who, like, you don't call yourself a Christ follower. And people will say to me over coffee or lunch or whatever, like, I love Narrate, I love serving the community, I love how it emphasizes character and being the right kind of person. And so I'm not a follower of Jesus, but I love all those things, and therefore I'm a part of Narrate. That's okay, right? And I'm going, yes. And I hope there's always space for people like yourself. And yet I think this morning what we can do is do some work in distinguishing what is the difference between being a person who's trying to be the right kind of person and being a Christ follower. Because though I think they have more in common than differences, there are some important distinctions, and I think this morning we'll kind of get into that. This last December, and I think, when I said the word, did you just kind of flinch? Like, there's something about December, isn't there? I think that all of us find December to be extraordinarily challenging, busy, crazy, ironically crazy. But this last December, where all of this view came from for me, or my understanding of this toxic view, was I became aware this last December. It was the first time in my tenure here at Narrate where I found myself going, okay, Lord, I don't know that I can take another minute of it. Like, it was the first time, quite honestly, and I'll have people say things to me like, oh, planting a church, and I go, like, it hasn't been that bad. It's been a blast. We have lots of incredible people, and I mean that. It hasn't been that bad. It's been a blast. But this last December, quite honestly, was the first time I've ever caught myself going, okay, Lord, like, I don't know what burnout looks like, and I really don't like the term burnout, but I've had friends that have burned out, and I don't think I'm burning out, but maybe, like, I finally feel tired. And that, for me, provoked a conversation that I think brought to the surface a toxic view. Listen, I guess I want to start here. I wonder if I'm the only one that at times feels overwhelmed. It's kind of arrogant, right? Like, we're all overwhelmed. It's December, it's overwhelming, whether you work in retail or you work in an office, and part of the trouble there is, like, you're trying to get 30 days of work done in 20 working days. Life is stressful. Some of you buried a parent this year. And what you're navigating, like, you thought life was difficult before, now you're trying to navigate all your responsibilities and taking care of a widowed mom. So some of you, a year ago, you weren't married. Now you are, and life was busy before you were married, and now you're, like, wondering what you did with all your time before. So some of you, maybe the overwhelming nature is you're a parent now. Maybe you're not just a parent. Maybe you've got a couple kids, and you're going like, man, my wife and I, we had this book written on how to raise kids, and we had our first kid, and everything was going great. Then we had our second kid, and we threw the book in the fireplace. Maybe you're at a spot where organizationally, like, you have more responsibility than you ever dreamt that you would have. And you thought that if you ever had this much responsibility, if you ever managed this many people, if the organization ever needed this from you, if you ever had to take care of budgets this big, if you ever had this many people on your staff, if there were ever this many people that depended upon you for things, that you'd be the happiest, most fulfilled person in the world. But maybe you oftentimes find yourself thinking on your walk to the office or on the morning after 2 days off for the first time in a long time, you find yourself thinking, I don't know that I want any of this. Maybe the payments, maybe the money you make, maybe it's not worth it. I talk with parents who, they have children, especially when it's adult children, who are off the rails. And maybe you're just at this spot like, I just can't take it. I guess what I want to get into this morning is work and how quickly it feels overwhelming and how quickly it allows a toxic view to develop. Because have you ever considered where work comes from? I think it's even subtle in that video, the whole corporate shot that was taken. I think sometimes, don't we assume that work is a product of the fall? Don't we oftentimes assume that work, the fact that we have to, like, work and do things, that somehow that's a punishment for sin? I often feel like the way people talk about work and the way they talk about the life before the fall is the assumption was that people would have sat in some garden thing and smoked their hobbit pipes and drank their pina coladas, and were it not for sin, like, it was just going to be a perpetual garden, and you'd eat raw carrots, and there'd be vines everywhere, and there would never be any development that happens. But it's not really the picture of Scripture. Like, if you open to Genesis 1:28, listen to this, and maybe you want to go back to this in your own solitude chair time this week. But just note how many words in this one verse that they imply responsibility. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful. Responsibility. Increase in number. It's a great responsibility. Fill the earth. Responsibility. Subdue it. Responsibility. Rule. That's a responsibility over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over every living creature that moves on the ground. Like, no wonder you're tired. Because what the text tells is of a God who created things and created people and then said, okay, people, you're going to be responsible for a lot of this stuff. And I think it's worth pointing out before we conclude that work is the problem, that all came before sin. And what I found myself wrestling with in December is, okay, so if responsibility is not the problem, then what is the problem? And listen, I understand burnout can happen and you can have too many responsibilities, but for the sake of conversation, if we could just assume that responsibility wasn't your problem, what does that leave? And part of what has been standing out to me is that in Genesis, there's not just responsibility, there's something else. And there's not just something else, but there's an order in Genesis. That yes, there's a God who wanted people to have responsibility, but before that, there's a God who wanted relationship. And I think you can make a pretty solid argument that the relationship came before the responsibility, which has led me to this several-week question of, like, what if all the stress, what if all the, I can't take another minute of this, God, I can't believe you invented parenting, this was a terrible idea. What if all that, what if it's born of just getting the order wrong? Listen, I'm not even necessarily, you may or may not agree with a God who loves you and calls you to relationship, but just for the sake of the next 25 minutes, what if all of it? What if first and foremost it's born from getting the order wrong, from thinking the work comes first and the relationship is negotiable? You know, there's, some of you may remember there was a crash in 1972, Southeast Airlines Flight 401. Anybody remember that? You don't have to raise your hand if you were alive and remember the crash. It was a crash into the Florida Everglades. It was the first ever wide-body airplane crash in American history. It was one of the most lethal crashes. 100-plus people on board were killed. It crashed into the Everglades while it was headed in for landing. And immediately the investigators were able to figure out that part of what perturbed them about the crash was that they quickly figured out there were no vital part failures. None of the vital systems within the airplane failed. And they were a bit flummoxed, and they began to ask, okay, so if there weren't these catastrophic mechanical failures, what went wrong? And they began to dig deeper. And what they found was that as the plane was coming in for landing, the first officer did his duty, one of his duties, which was flip a button, a switch that caused the nose gear of the nose landing gear of the airplane to come out and lock into position. He did that. He flipped that button. That landing gear did that. It locked into position, but something didn't happen. What didn't happen was the little green light that indicated to the controllers of the airplane that the landing gear was down in locked position. It didn't light up. He told his fellow pilot. They quickly determined, apparently, that the gear was down and locked. There were systems that allowed them to work around the light. But nonetheless, they stayed hyper-focused on the light that didn't turn on. Well, what happened was in their hyper-focus on said light, they failed to identify the fact that the autopilot of the airplane had been turned off. And in their hyper-fixation on the light, they failed to pay attention to what really matters when flying an airplane, and that is altitude. And by the time they realized it, that the airplane effectively landed itself in the Everglades, there was nothing they could do. I guess the suggestion that I want to make this morning, simplistic though it may be, is what if it's quite possible as a well-intentioned Christ follower to get really, really fixated on the light and miss what's really important about trying to follow Jesus, and that is relationship with God. You know, one of the things that I love about like historic Orthodox biblical Christianity is like we're not the first ones to go through this stuff. And I think part of what the benefit of the humility of going, we didn't figure this out, we're standing on people's shoulders as we can hear their stories and our stories. And ironically, this happened among the very first churches. In the book of Revelation, you know, it's your favorite quiet time material because it's so clear and uncontroversial. In in the book of Revelation, Jesus addresses the seven, I believe it's these seven major churches who are the young churches in his movement. Listen to what he says to this church in Ephesus. He says, I know your deeds, your hard work and your perseverance. Something like, hey, I know you charter buses for underprivileged kids and put them on the ski hill. I know you love to scatter. I know you love to matter. I know that you're the kind of neighbor and the kind of coworker who serves people. I know that you cannot tolerate wicked people, that you have tested those who claim to be apostles but are not. I know that know-it-alls drive you crazy. You found them false. He's affirming there's all these things you do for me. Good job. But then listen to verse 4. Yet I hold this against you. You've forsaken the love you had at first. And I think inside of that is a historic warning of how easy it is as Christ followers to set out from a spot where we understood that God made us. We're blown away in our own brokenness that God loves us and wants to use us. We set out and go, okay, Lord, however you want to use me. You want me to wash dishes? You want me to scrub toilets? Whatever you want me to do, Lord, it's your gig. I'll do it. And in the course of months and years and especially decades, we arrive at a different spot. And I wonder if the way we could describe that spot is we arrive at a view of God that says God needs us. That he needs us to do certain things for him. And if he doesn't, his kingdom might crumble a little bit. I wonder, here's one way we could frame it in a question. What if you've developed a view of God that treats doing stuff for God as more important than doing stuff with him? Let me ask you this. Why did you get married? Because you wanted somebody to do some stuff for you? Or because you looked forward to a life of doing stuff with somebody? Why do we have kids? Why do we have friends? Is it because we want servants? Or we want to be a servant? Or is this profound desire within the wiring that I think is born of God that says we want to do things with people? What if that's what Jesus is saying there? That's what John is saying to Ephesus is listen. Don't confuse your desire to do stuff for Jesus with his desire to do stuff with him. You know, for me, that this whole thing reminds me of a particular story in the text that, quite frankly, has framed my understanding of God and relationship with him and serving him since the time I was 18 years old. In fact, this passage was preached on before I was a Christ follower on my graduation from high school day. It goes back to Exodus and the story of Moses. Now, you've probably at least seen one of the bad movies, or maybe you've heard about him or read about him, but Moses, just as quick recount, Moses was born at a time when, which, by the way, I haven't seen the new movie, so I don't know if it's good or bad. But he was born at a time when it was illegal to be a Hebrew boy. He was put into a basket. He was rescued from that basket by the house of Pharaoh, which means this boy who wasn't even supposed to be alive was raised by the household of Pharaoh. He was raised up in the Pharaoh's education with all his privileges and advantages. And we don't know exactly when, but at around age 40 years old, he became aware of the fact, we don't know when he became aware that he was a Hebrew, not an Egyptian, but he did become more and more sensitive to the fact that the Hebrews were being told that they were subhuman by the Egyptian people and they needed a leader, not altogether different than the person who works for a company who goes, this company's doing it wrong, let's go do it right. Moses rose up within that and said, I'm going to be that leader, I'm going to be that savior. You go read about him in Stephen's speech in the book of Acts, and Moses had this strong desire to lead a rebellion. And his strategy, because we all have to come up with one, was that he was going to do something loud that demonstrated to the Hebrews that they could trust him, that he could be counted on for his courage. And so he committed an act of murder. The hope was that upon that murder, everybody would recognize him as their courageous savior, and they would rise up and follow him, and they'd get their own country, and they'd have their own Pharaoh, Moses. None of it worked out. Moses committed murder. The people didn't see him as their leader. He had to flee for his life. He ended up in Midian, where he became a shepherd. He had to completely reinvent himself, a completely different career, a completely different family, completely different friends, perhaps even a different language. And he spent 40 years as a shepherd in the land of Midian. And one day, at around 80, he happened upon a bush that was on fire but didn't burn up. And he came up next to the bush, and the bush started talking to him. The bush, the Spirit of God was in the bush. I know this is crazy. This is why belief is belief. He comes up next to the bush, and the bush is God speaking to him. And he says to Moses, Moses, I've heard the cry of these people in Egypt, the Hebrew people, and I'm going to rescue them. And then you just wonder if Moses had the courage to sarcastically go, well, congratulations, like I saw that 40 years ago. And God began to articulate to Moses, like, these people need a leader. And Moses said, I agreed. And then in before verse 11, don't go there yet. Then God says to Moses, Moses, you're my guy. And Moses is like, no, you don't understand. I got C's. Like, there's these guys that I went to class with. They're A+ people. There's these other people. I've seen them in action. They're your guy. I just wonder if Moses thought that maybe the crosshairs of the universe got overlapped for a second and somehow there was a mistake and like, God, I got on the bus 10 minutes early and like Freddie got on it 10 minutes late. And so if you just wait another 10 minutes, the right guy to lead this thing will be here, but it's not me. And he had every reason to say that because he tried it and he failed. Perhaps even he put something out in front of God and went like, maybe he believed he was God's leader 40 years ago. But after that kind of failure, he couldn't believe it anymore. And listen to Moses' response to God. He says, who am I? Now, when you say, who am I, what are you looking for? Oh, shucks, come on. You're the best one for it, right? Come on, you can do this. Who am I that I should go before Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God's response has literally, for me, shaped my understanding of what it means to be in a relationship with him for almost 18 years. God's response is simply this: I'll be with you. Moses, I'm not asking you to do something for me. I'm asking you to do something with me. Moses, I'm not asking you to do this because you're so qualified and you're so perfect and there's not a better person for the job anywhere in the world. That has nothing to do with it. Moses, I'm not telling you to lead those people. I'm not telling you to raise those kids. I'm not telling you to lead that organization. I'm not telling you that those people are going to report to you. I'm not telling you any of that because there's not a better person in the world more qualified. Moses, I'm telling you that because it's my gig. And I'm inviting you into my story. It has a star. It's not you. But I would love for you to be a part of it. See, I wonder if you two can relate to how easy it is to transfer from a God that you don't even deserve to be a part of his story to a God who so desperately needs you. I wonder if you think about the stressors you have at work and at home and with medical issues and all of that, if you've lost sight of a God who says, I haven't promised much other than I'll be with you. And I want to do this with you. I want to walk through this with you. And it's not your gig. It's my gig. You know, for me, my breakthrough, which I'm like that dog who returns to his vomit. I have to learn the same lessons over and over and over again. I was finishing up a run on Christmas Eve. And if you just flinched when I said that, that's because you work for a church or were volunteering at one on Christmas Eve, because Christmas Eve is a day that you don't really note unless you do one of those things. It's an incredibly stressful time, privileged time, but stressful time. I could take you to the block on Lawrence where I was coming down off La Grande on a run. And I was painfully aware that I was the wrong kind of person for about the last 6 weeks. That in the midst of my Lord, it's too much, I can't take this, I was also the type of leader and friend and dad and husband that no one ever really aspires to be. And I don't think I was even actively thinking about those things, but as I was coming down the hill, I had this profound sense, and listen, the skies didn't split open, a dove didn't land on the bill of my hat, I don't wear hats when I run, I didn't hear an audible voice, I understand it's freaky when someone says, I heard God, because it's so subjective, and so ultimately, I have to decide whether I did and you do, but as I was coming down that hill, I just had this profound sense, a thought that I hadn't had in a long time, and it was simply this: Adam, you feel overwhelmed because you feel inferior. And I could take you back to the few thoughts that I had over the course of the next block, but they all centered around, Adam, you're about to be found out. That's what you feel. You feel like you're about to be found out, that you're not good enough, that suddenly everyone's going to realize that you're not anywhere near as good as you are, and you're not good enough to lead this organization, and you're about to be its weakest link. Some people call it inferiority complex. Some of it, imposter syndrome is a clinical description. It's this fear that you're not good enough. You're not a good enough mom, you're not a good enough dad, you're not a good enough leader, whatever that is. And the moment I had that thought, because listen, this is I return to this thought every couple of years, and I worked through this a couple of years ago, and instantly it gave me the handles to go back to what I needed to. And it was all this reminder, oh yeah, I never thought I could do this 5 years ago. I never thought I could do this 10 years ago. This isn't about me. This is God's deal. And it's why when I'm most healthy, I get on my knees and go, Lord, this is your church. I was just talking with a friend about some of the stuff that was done in Ecuador through Families with Heart, and I alluded to that last week. And what I love about all that is it's not scalable. And I found myself saying to our friend Jack, who connected us with a lot of this, I just said, it's just an amazing thing that's happening down there. In the weeks that follow, I'll show you a video of a kid who's been sponsored for 3 years by a Narrate family, and 3 years ago he couldn't walk. And now he can. He's got a degenerative issue, and you'll see that it's like something off of 60 Minutes, this kid hobbling around a room who 3 years ago couldn't walk. And you can hear Nareem in Spanish in the background saying, next time we're here, you're going to be jogging. And there's this profound sense. I said to my friend, boy, I don't know that this is sustainable. I know it's not scalable. And if this lasts for a few years, fantastic. If it lasts for 10, that'd be great. And I think that's the mindset of what Moses is experiencing there, isn't it? Moses, I'm not telling you to do this because you can. Let's go back to when you made a decision to follow Jesus. Back to when you were that high school girl, or you were that 20-something guy, or you were that 30-something who had just gone through a devastating divorce and you couldn't possibly figure out what your next step was. Wasn't the cry of your heart like, okay, Lord, whatever. You tell me that I'm valuable. You tell me you love me. You tell me you can use me. Okay, whatever. And isn't it easy to develop and allow that to become a toxic view that says God needs you? That he depends upon you? What if you could get back to the simplicity of, wow, with God, not for him? John Gottman, when you ask this question, how do you exist in relationship and how do you keep it about relationship? I think John Gottman can help us a lot. That's him and his wife. John is this very well-respected, you can Wikipedia or Google him, and he's one of the most decorated and celebrated and trusted marriage therapists in the world today. And his methodology is unique, but his results are trustworthy. What he likes to do is take couples and put them in kind of a living room type setting, if I understand it correctly, and have like kind of hidden video cameras on them, and he just likes to record their interactions for hours and sometimes days. John has demonstrated through his research that he can predict with 91% accuracy whether or not a couple will stay happily married simply by watching them interact, never directly talking to them at all. One of the things he watches for, I think there's 5, it's 4 or 5, you can read his book. One of them that he's watching for is what he calls chit-chat. He said all couples, they can talk about the big stuff, they can talk about moves and job changes, they can talk about tragedy. But he said, I'm watching for couples who, when the husband says something, the wife looks up from her magazine. When the wife says something, the husband actually cares to listen. I'm watching for couples who have the ability to conversate about really nothing at all, but be engaged in the conversation. He goes on to explain that great relationships aren't born of mountaintop experiences. People who get divorced and people who don't, they all have similar things in common. They all go on great vacations. They all have good Christmas mornings. He said that's not really the make or break in a relationship. The make or break is the ability to dialogue about nothing. I wonder, is the same thing true of God? Is God too, like those of you that have a relationship with him, I'll bet you could point to 1 or 2 mountaintop experiences at a camp or something you experienced as a high school student, or maybe it was a mountaintop experience as you were going through some horrible thing in your adult life. But I'll bet you whether or not you have those doesn't determine whether or not you have a good relationship with God. Isn't it your ability to sit at your computer at work and chit-chat? Your ability to stay connected throughout the day? It's the mundane, right? Ray Vanderland points out that in the Hebrew calendar, there's festivals. That there are a lot of days of festival celebration. And yet there aren't anywhere near as many as there are just mundane, everyday, normal days. Listen, the strength of your relationship with God isn't hinged upon this experience because you only get this once a week. It's what you do with the other 6. What if the stress really is from your thinking that God needs you? Maybe just reminding ourselves of a few simple things, like that God knows you. Maybe we've become too developed in our thinking of God. Listen to Psalm 139. You've searched me, Lord, and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise, you perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You're familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you, Lord, know it completely. What if we sit and remind ourselves that God knows us and that he cares for us? I love the verse Kate put up there during the offering of cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. That he wants to chit-chat about the stuff that's bugging you. That he wants to stay connected. There's the reminder that Jesus invites us to call him Abba. Not the high formal word of father, but the cultural equivalent of Papa. That God is not this morose, distant being, but this personal father and friend. That God invites you to abide in him. Listen, I guess ultimately what I'm trying to suggest is what if there's a toxic view that really starts to believe that God is far more interested in what we do for him than doing it with him? And for those of you that have followed Jesus, or you identify yourself as one, what if you could live in the Exodus 3, like, God, it's not about the green light. It's about connection with you and living life with you. And for those of you that you've never really been able to distinguish what is the difference between being the right kind of person and a Christ follower, and listen, that's a fair question, because in so many ways in our culture, Jesus has defined historically what it means to be the right kind of person, whether you believe that he was God or not. But I think one very important distinction is that Jesus doesn't call us to do it for him. He invites us to do it with him. He's not looking for mercenaries who will go out there and do his bidding. He's looking for friends who will walk in relationship with him. What if the God of the universe really can know everything about you and everyone else? And what if that inflated sense of self-importance is maybe the most toxic one of all?
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.